Hello, my name is Alesia Jung, and I am a PhD candidate of epidemiology at the University of Arizona. Today, my presentation will be on women firefighters and the risk of miscarriage. The reproductive health of women firefighters is an understudied research area. However, we do know that U.S. career firefighters have an increased report of pregnancy loss and preterm births. We also know that South Korean firefighters have increased rates of hospital admissions for adverse pregnancy, childbirth, and post-childbirth outcomes. Although we don't understand the mechanisms behind these associations, they may involve occupational exposures and working conditions reported to be associated with these outcomes in other populations. Also, while there is still much we don't know, some of the questions that remain include, are these increased rates unique to career firefighters? Also, what occupational aspects are risk factors for adverse reproductive outcomes? In this analysis, I specifically wanted to examine occupational factors among women firefighters and risk of miscarriage by first comparing prevalence of miscarriage among firefighters to rates from non-firefighting population. Second, by evaluating associations between occupational factors and miscarriage. So I performed a cross-sectional analysis of data collected by NDRI USA's Center for Fire, Rescue, and EMS Health Research as part of their Health and Wellness of Women Firefighters study. The eligibility criteria for this analysis included being a resident, U.S. resident who reported having at least one pregnancy while working in the fire service. I also excluded pregnancies that were still in progress at the time of the survey in 2017, or pregnancies with missing outcomes or missing a priori, meaning pre-specified confounder information. The outcome of interest were pregnancies reported to result in miscarriage, compared to pregnancies of fetuses still at risk, so pregnancies that resulted in stillbirths, pregnancy terminations, or live births. Exposures of interest included occupational factors such as employment status, career versus volunteer, wildland/WUI firefighter status, shift schedule among career firefighters, and report of actively working fire rescue calls at pregnancy start. And then on the right is a list of the a priori confounders that were adjusted for in my regression models. So first I calculated standardized estimates of miscarriages among most recent pregnancies of firefighters compared to rates from a non-firefighting population. And this non-firefighting population was taken from a previous study of US nurses. In fact, women from the Nurses Health Study 2 who self-reported in 2001 information about their most recent pregnancy while working as a nurse. Second, I ran regression models to evaluate associations between firefighter occupational factors and miscarriage. Specifically, I used generalized estimating equations models to look at all pregnancies that occurred in the fire service and calculate relative risks and 95% confidence intervals. I also assessed if there was effect modification by maternal age at pregnancy or employment status on the associations of interest. So based on the total women who responded to the 2017 NDRI USA survey, 1,058 women, about 33%, met the eligibility criteria. Among these women, there were 1,830 total pregnancies, and about 21% resulted in a miscarriage. So here I'm going to highlight a few key demographics of the total sample group, so in the rightmost column. On average, participants were 40 years old, mostly white and non-Hispanic. About 20% were obese in 2017, as well as 24% reported being current or former smokers. On average, participants had 2 pregnancies, and about 34% reported experiencing a miscarriage at some point in their life. Participants had an average of 13.5 years of work experience in the fire service. And at the time of the survey, it had been about 6 years since their most recent pregnancy in the fire service. More than half of the women in this analysis were firefighters or cross-trained firefighter paramedics. So this table displays age-standardized prevalences of miscarriages. And highlighted here, you can see that among all firefighters in the sample, the prevalence of miscarriage was more than 2 times greater than compared to a cohort of US nurses. And then when you stratified by firefighter designations, the prevalence of miscarriage remained elevated, but you can also see evidence of some variation. In this table, here are results from our fully adjusted regression models. Compared to volunteer firefighters, career firefighters had a lower risk, about 67% lower, of having a miscarriage while working in the fire service. Wildland/WUI firefighters had more than 2 times lower risk of miscarriage than non-wildland firefighters. And shift schedule and working fire rescue calls at pregnancy start were not associated with risk of miscarriage. However, when we looked at this model for wildland firefighter status, we did observe significant effect modification by employment status. So when we took this model and we stratified it by employment status, you can see that among volunteer firefighters, wildland firefighter status is no longer associated with miscarriage risk. However, among career firefighters, being a wildland or WUI firefighter remained associated with a lower risk of miscarriage compared to non-wildland firefighters. So to put some of these results in context, we did observe an increased prevalence of miscarriage throughout the fire service compared to a non-firefighting population. This supports previous studies that have examined career firefighters only or other adverse reproductive outcomes. Also, because nurses have been shown to self-report reproductive health data with high accuracy, our observation of increased prevalence among firefighters should be given greater consideration. Also, we observed a higher risk of miscarriage among volunteers compared to career firefighters, despite career firefighters being assumed to have greater fireground or occupational exposures due to either like a higher annual call volume or serving denser population centers and volunteer departments. However, it's also possible that volunteer firefighters have access to fewer resources, including staff, protective equipment, or training, or other things that could have contributed to overall greater occupational exposures than career firefighters. Second, our results should be considered. The results of our analysis should be considered in the context of the limitation of using surrogate measures for firefighting exposures. For example, being a wildland or WUI firefighter in 2017 does not equate to actively participating in wildland fire responses during a pregnancy. Second, assigned shift schedule, again reported in 2017, isn't guaranteed to capture voluntary or even mandatory overtime shifts that may have been worked. In fact, a previous study reported that insomnia or sleep disruption was associated with emergency events or off-duty work among firefighters, but not their assigned shift schedule. Also, previous studies that have reported that shift work is associated with adverse reproductive outcomes has been conducted in other industries such as healthcare that define shift work quite differently than in the fire service. Also, we didn't observe an association between working fire rescue calls at the pregnancy start and miscarriage risk. However, this could have been affected by issues of participants recalling work during pregnancy start or even the recalling pregnancy timing. However, despite these limitations, our data was quite robust to sensitivity analyses that we performed. So the key takeaways of this research are that miscarriages appear to be elevated among firefighters, and that there appears to be variation in miscarriage risk among the fire service, within the fire service. And more research is needed to understand the mechanisms of these outcomes in firefighters, especially if this information is to be utilized in the future to help inform department policies or personal decision-making. I'd like to thank my colleagues at the University of Arizona and NDRI USA, as well as everyone who was able to join us today. Thank you.